Hello and welcome to Daisey Talks episode 4. My name is Maciej Bukowski and I'm delighted to speak today to our guest Harry Nedelcu, who is the head of policy at Rasmussen Global, a political consultancy firm founded by the former Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who also is the former Danish Prime Minister. But Harry himself spent several years working at NATO, lectured at Canadian universities on subjects related to comparative politics, security and defense, and was a researcher at the Swedish National Defense College. He has written extensively on matters of East European politics and security, and in 2010 he published a book entitled Radical Right Parties in Eastern Europe, a post-EU integration study. Harry, thank you very much for accepting my invitation. To be perfectly honest, I think I could hardly have thought about anyone more suitable for this talk because we'll be discussing the politics of France in Eastern Europe. But had I been speaking to a French person, there would have been, I think, a significant risk of a bias so as to how the subject will be tackled. I think there's no such risk now, hopefully. So
So you think?
exactly, and so as a little bit of a perhaps introductory framework for the topic that we'll be tackling today. Also, the date we have chosen for this also probably could not have been better because of the still ongoing trip of President Macron in the Baltics, which was planned long ago, actually, long before the events that had been on the agenda of European diplomats for the last couple of weeks, which also obviously somehow overshadowed the agenda of President Macron as he's talking to the leaders of the Baltic states this week. I actually even watched yesterday his press conference with the Lithuanian president, and it was interesting to notice how, obviously there was the questions that were long plans that they want to discuss, like the cybersecurity and like the different fronts that are moving forward on together and European matters. But above all, obviously, there was the Belarusian question as well as the question of Mr. Navalny. And it was interesting to hear from Mr. Macron, who precisely, at least that's what often is said, somehow France attempts to play a kind of a double game now so as to both get the stick and the carrot out for Russia. And in terms of Navalny, like when he was asked what's the right course of European action in this regard, he said that the events took place in Russia, the liquid itself was produced in Russia, the whole thing was staged in Russia, so essentially it's up to Russians to lead the investigation and only for Europeans to somehow push them to do so. Like if it was like if he was somehow trying to also tell the Russian counterpart that we will not be pushing you too hard. So that's basically, I think, the first pillar of our discussion today: the French-Russian relations and their somewhat renewed rapprochement, because every once in a while France invites Russia to the European game when this fits its interests. It's been a year now, I think, since the two leaders of both countries formally launched a strategic dialogue that, by the way, caught many of France's European partners by surprise, including Germany, and has thus far, I think, yielded only very scant results. But the very the very direction that France has taken appears to be real. So that would be my first question to you. What do you think is the rationale for this happening now? What is France trying to achieve in the Eastern Europe now?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the question really should be, what role does this rapprochement play within what France is trying to achieve with respect to its foreign policy, both globally and with respect to Europe, and the two are actually very intertwined. France, especially under Macron, perhaps more under Macron than under previous presidents, has a new concept of itself within Europe and the role of Europe. what role should Europe really play? And it's really a concept where French prowess is understood through European prowess. And this is a bit of a departure from the understanding of, European soft power, and you can see that a lot in the language that is being employed. Strategic autonomy, really, a greater role for Europe in order to avoid being caught between great power conflicts, and really a tougher Europe, both when it comes to unity and solidarity within Europe, but also when it comes to how Europe deals with the outside. So to understand what Macron is doing, it's really understanding it through that, understanding it through what he's trying to achieve really when it comes to rethinking basically the security structure in Europe. And that is not to say that he's being naive, that Macron wants to give it a shot with Putin. I don't think that's the case. I think he understands, where Putin is coming from, and I think he understands what he can achieve by that. But he's trying to really sort of keep that channel alive, because through dialogue with the Russians, you basically keep France powerful and you give a role for Europe. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you go back to the old paradigm, which is to say, okay, well, then we just have to depend on the transatlantic relationship and the framework only within NATO, which, as you know, France is very critical of, Macron is very critical of, and even though, okay, perhaps the whole brain dead sort of label was a bit unfortunate in terms of the way he said it, and maybe that's not what he meant, but there's a clear sense in France that, no longer can we just assume that we can just automatically depend on our transatlantic relationship. And for that reason, you have to have basically a Europe that sort of stands up a little bit more for itself. Hence, in order to back that up, you have to keep this dialogue with the Russians alive, even though, and by the way, inside France, this has come under a lot of criticism, by the way. And you can even look at Macron's own kind of position when he came to Lithuania, for instance, and he's in Lithuania actually right now as we're having this conversation. And you could see that his attitude betrays the fact that he already kind of knows that, this strategic dialogue with Putin perhaps might not generate that many results after all. So it all goes to say that, yes, this might seem a bit concerning. Of course, in Germany, it raised eyebrows, of course, in Eastern Europe. But I would not make too much out of it, other than to say, we should see this from the prism of Macron's new vision for Europe.
Mm-hmm. All right. But it's at the same time, what do you think is going to be the costs of, so to speak, Russia's invitation extended to France through the negotiations of the Belarus future, for example, which seems to be like that question around which much of the action and the talk as well surrounding France's stretching of muscles in the Eastern European theater seems to somehow surround. And so, what do you think this, for example, could Russia count on France to push for taking down some of the EU sanctions imposed following the Russian annexation of Crimea? What are the benefits perhaps might Russia get from France? And interestingly, just one remark we forgot to this. Just last week, I spoke to the president of the Polish-Belarusian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and then when asked about a similar question, although more from the business perspective, he said that Russians, in fact, in his opinion, which I do not necessarily concur with, are not that interested in getting the sanctions down, because, in fact, these are pushing them as a country and as its economy to undergo the reforms which they have been, postponing ever since they realized that they can rely on natural resources to get, reach at least the portions of the society and the decision makers to get the reach. But I do not necessarily think that this is what decision makers in Kremlin think. So, do you believe that sanctions are in fact what taking them down is what the Russians are interested in getting in all this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that Russia does not want sanctions taken away. This is an issue that is both economic, but it also, it's an issue of prestige for Russia as well,
Yeah.
right? It's about Russia's place, and this is what Russia has actually always cared about. It feels that it does not have its rightful place that it deserves on the international scene. Yes, it's true that the longer that sanctions would stay there, the longer that Russia will get used to them and will try to mitigate the effects of those sanctions. That is true. But at the same time, sanctions are a problem for Putin. Russia is sort of the outcast on the international scene. Look at G7. Even though in some fora Russia has been invited back in, but there's still that stigma that actually what Russia did, especially in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea, was completely breaching every tenet of the international law, and that's not going to go away. By the way, Macron, and this is why this strategic dialogue is actually going nowhere. Macron fundamentally is not going to move on any of this. If you look at, for instance, on all the main files, Nord Stream 2, for instance,
right,
or sanctions, Macron came out extremely strong. Macron is extremely strong on Nord Stream 2. He even criticized Nord Stream 2. On sanctions, Macron never indicated that this would be on the table unless Russia moves back to the situation that was there and reverts the situation that was there before 2014. So it's not that Macron would ever give in on the main. I don't think he would give in on the main issues. And this is partly why this dialogue is kind of going nowhere, because Putin, whether he might want sanctions lifted or not, needs to move fundamentally, not on Belarus, but on Ukraine. Mm-hmm. He needs to do something that is, fundamental on Donbass, for instance, which is going nowhere. Even with a new president now in Ukraine for the past year, and a new government and new attempts to meet the Russians halfway and restart Normandy 4. Ultimately, what we see is, we see some prisoner exchanges, and we do see some tiny dialogues and movements here and there. But when it comes to the fundamentals, nothing is really happening. And Putin cannot actually give in on the fundamental, which is to say, okay, let's restore the border in Donbass to the actual border and pull those Russian troops out. He's not going to do that. Mm-hmm. And in the end, this is where we're getting stuck. Belarus is sort of, it plays a small role, I would say, in the greater picture that is unraveling between Russia and the West.
Just to follow up,
yes.
real quick on what you said on Donbass. Do you think perhaps that it might precisely be the point that Putin is trying to make to somehow maintain this quagmire, this state of uncertainty at the border and in that region, so as to perhaps, whenever this becomes politically or otherwise beneficial to him, that, he will escalate or not, or precisely do the opposite when this will be, what will he be more interested in. So do you think do you expect any major moves in near future as to, whether coming from the Russians or rather, the Ukrainian side in terms of like the initiatives or proposal, or even maybe on the other end, some military moves?
Military moves that are major in terms of, high scale invasions or that sort of thing. Absolutely not. I don't see it happening. The Russians actually have no interest of doing that. They already have pretty much done what they wanted to do, which is to make it so difficult for Ukraine to talk about NATO, to talk about EU membership, once you have, basically a chunk of your country that you do not control. So from the Russian point of view, yes, of course, Putin could escalate a little bit, maybe take a village or a town, or, have a small scale attack in a certain section of the contact line. But I don't think, especially now, less now than before, that there's a chance for the Russians to escalate this into an all-out war with Ukraine. And by the way, it's the same thing for Belarus. Since we're talking about Belarus, and there's always been this talk about Putin actually coming in and taking over Belarus using the Russian military. That would be probably the worst case scenario. Like Macron said, it would be the worst case scenario for Europe, but it would also be the worst case scenario for Putin. That's not what Putin would want to do, for the sheer fact, which by now is becoming clear, that Belarus and what's happening in Belarus is fundamentally different from what was happening in Ukraine in 2013, 2014.
Right.
In Ukraine, there was a geopolitical vector attached to the political debates that were domestic, just like in Moldova, by the way. Mm-hmm. In Belarus, this is fundamentally different, because in Belarus, nobody is pro-Russia versus pro-West. The debates there are solely domestic, and they have to do Lukashenko. But for everyone else, the issue is geopolitical. For us in the West, it's geopolitical. For Putin, it's geopolitical. However, if Putin were to act, he would turn the debate that is domestic in Belarus into a geopolitical confrontation as well. In other words, he would turn the Belarusians against the Russians, which right now is not the case. Mm-hmm. Right now, the conversation is solely about Lukashenko and getting rid of him. So for Putin to escalate, to invade Belarus would be the worst case scenario. Probably what they would want to do right now, and what is probably in the cards, is to have an Armenia type scenario, mm-hmm. where you can manage a transition. You do it slowly, and you give it sort of the aura of constitutional sort of change, and then you say, okay, you can have your reformists, and you can have them take over and domestically reform the state. But when it comes to your foreign policy, you align yourselves with Russia.
Right.
That's probably as far as Putin is willing to go.
The comparison with Armenia, although is not fortunate to the extent of how Armenians may feel at this very moment, when Russians are not supporting them to the extent similar to which Turkey is supporting Azerbaijan, right, in the conflict that's just being escalated. So I wonder if Belarus would perhaps that would be an interesting scenario for the country, whereas they would somehow maintain that illusion of independence while still being significantly dependent, actually, in both economic and political and all other terms on the big neighbor. But getting focused now more on Belarus itself and France again, actually. So what interest does you think France have in Belarus? Is it only, as some suggest, it's about its willingness to participate in the unachieved process of privatization of the Belarusian economy, which is expected to resume, regardless even perhaps of the political events and their outcome? Or are there some perhaps also political benefits that its involvement in the dealings with the Belarusian question may bring it? What is your take?
Again, Belarus here has to be understood from the role that it plays within France's greater global vision for itself, for France, within a more united Europe. And that is really, like I was saying before, it's Macron's vision, right? Belarus is a case study for the way in which the French can talk to the Russians. And this is what Macron is doing right now, actually. Through his meeting with Tikhanovskaya, for instance, through him saying Lukashenko has to go. This is sending a clear message to Putin, but it's also a message to Putin that, look, we need to talk about this. We need to sit down and have a conversation on this. If I'm not mistaken, right now, Macron has become the most prominent international leader that meets Tikhanovskaya. Mm-hmm. So what is he saying? He's saying, I recognize her as being the president-elect. We do not recognize Lukashenko. So whereas on Ukraine, the file is a bit stuck because, again, like I said before, on the main fundamentals, there's no movement. On Belarus, Macron can come out and he can do two things. He can, one, he can turn this strategic discussion with the Russians into something that can generate something meaningful, which could be change for Belarus, even if, like we said before, it could be, ultimately still a government that is aligned with the Russians, but at least a reformist government inside Belarus, which perhaps would also be maybe willing to talk to the Europeans a little bit more as well. Who knows? Maybe the Russians are willing to accept a more neutral Belarus as long as it's not, as long as it doesn't fall within the Western camp. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. The second is to champion this role for Europe that he's been arguing for since his campaign, really, which is a Europe that is able to speak and engage with the outside world a little bit more. This whole idea of strategic autonomy, this whole idea of geopolitical Europe, which, by the way, it's been a concept that has been picked up in the rest of the EU as well. We see it in the discourses of the Germans. We see it in von der Leyen's State of the Union speech. It's something that is reflected outside the EU as well. And of course, Macron obviously sees himself as playing a leading role, especially when we look at Germany, Merkel's, still there, but we know that she will not be there in the next year or two. So Macron has this opportunity to be, that champion of Europe and that champion of this sort of new, united, stronger Europe. And Belarus is a case study for that.
Mm-hmm. So do you see his, big gamble in this regard, so to speak, as his attempts to somehow awaken France's Eastern policy as a way for him to perhaps reassess his, French, they love these powerful presidents who, stand up for the nation. And do you feel like all this is kind of it's part of its political also motives so as to have a better position for the upcoming presidential elections in France, which are, coming up sooner rather than later?
I mean, if you look at the polls, he's not doing very well. Especially on domestic issues, Macron is not doing well in the polls at all. But interestingly enough, on foreign policy, French respondents are more likely to say, look, he did manage to represent France well on the international global scene. So undoubtedly, of course, that is part of his calculus ahead of the elections. But again, he campaigned when he got elected. He started already campaigning on this big tenet about reforming Europe. His message was very pro-European. Actually, like I said, he's one of the most probably pro-European presidents in a very, very long time. So there's nothing new here. This is something that resonates with French voters. It's something that appeals to them as well. So of course, elections are playing a role, but it's also bigger than that. It's really about his vision for Europe, and I do think he genuinely believes that this is something that he can pull through.
Mm-hmm. All right. And more broadly, perhaps, in terms of France's investments, in terms of its diplomatic investments and its actions undertaken in the Eastern Theater, don't you feel like it is a little bit of a show that, in fact, is overstretching its muscles? For example, in its dealings with with Belarus, that in a way that the efforts undertaken by Macron are in fact disproportionately larger than its geostrategic assets actually available in the region. I mean, France does not really have military resources allowing it to control the escalation ladder in the region should that become necessary, for instance. And this goes, in fact, for both conventional arms as well as nuclear arms, the later of which are said to have strictly defensive qualities and are incapable of effective offensive positioning. Is this something you would agree with? And what is your view on this?
I think France's diplomatic offensive, let's call it that, when it comes to Belarus, depends more on its ability to speak to others and other partners in Europe than its strategic assets around Belarus, because
Yeah.
no one really has strategic assets around Belarus except Russia. And like we said before, even Russia would really like not to play, probably would not want to play that card. So it's not that someone here wants to escalate. And it's not about having those assets in order to be able to carry out this diplomatic offensive, but rather being able to speak to others. And maybe this visit of Macron to Lithuania played out quite well, because it is a chance for Macron to showcase the fact that he's able to create these type of sort of agreements within the EU with interested stakeholders. It's kind of a similar approach that Macron adopted with the Germans when it came to European solidarity. Mm-hmm. So before the July agreement on a recovery plan for Europe, it was really Macron trying to push the idea of European solidarity in light of COVID, negotiating with the Germans and agreeing with the Germans in May, and then being able to create that sort of coalition within the EU and then to carry it forward. Mm-hmm. So I would say it's less about your strategic assets in terms of your military assets than it is about being able to convince other Europeans that this is the way to go. So far, on some important files, Macron is doing very well. Again, solidarity is a great example. Yeah. It was a tough one to pull, and he did it. And then they had the agreement in July. Yes, it's still contingent on the European Parliament, and of course the debates on within Council, which are going to happen on the 1st and 2nd. But it is something that Macron did very well on the other side, which is a stronger European voice and placing Europe sort of as a third pillar on the international scene. That is where we have to see whether he can do the same thing. And that is really talking to the Eastern member states, the Southern member states, trying to mitigate between their various interests. That's what he's trying to do in Lithuania right now.
Okay. And perhaps as we start to conclude the chapter on Belarus itself, 2 last questions, in fact, that I will try to somehow combine into one longer one. I was wondering if you could perhaps share your thoughts on a question that I think has been resurging lately, that within the EU and especially the Western powers of the European Union, that they have different priorities in terms of um, external relations as such of the Union, but also on the Eastern European theater in particular. As for Belarus itself, as which is kind of a catalyst, I think, for these divergences between these different positions. Would you agree that there are different stakes and interests, let's say, between France and Germany, and if so, how are they disparate? And also the question that I wanted to ask as a separate one, but I think it kind of is part of the same team. For instance, in Poland, where I am there has been this kind of angry talk lately that there's this negotiation table at which we are not present because France and Germany and others are playing so as to exclude us from it. Perhaps because we have insufficiently strong armed forces, or maybe precisely because they want to take all the space that there is for others than Russia for themselves. But I also was curious about your thoughts on this, like how these relations between, or rather, maybe let's put it this way: um, do you find it, let's say, natural that the Western states of the EU try to have a bigger say in Eastern matters than Eastern states themselves?
Um, that's an interesting question. And I'll rather focus on this because I think this is quite pertinent. When it comes to Macron's relationship, or France's relationship with Poland under Macron, we have a number of files where the French and the Poles do not agree. There are differences. There are differences on climate. There are differences on defense integration. There are differences on the issue of rule of law. There are differences on the way they view, obviously, Russia policy, but there are also differences on the way they view the transatlantic relationship. And then, of course, from that, you extrapolate, and then there are differences in the way they see Europe as well. There was a poll recently, I forgot who carried out that poll, but in essence, French respondents and Polish respondents are diametrically opposed when they're being asked about, how do they view security, and what do they, or which institution would they depend on, or what would they depend on, not institution, what would they depend on when it comes to security? The French would say the EU, Polish respondents would say the United States. Also different ways of looking at NATO as well. Mm-hmm. So these are divergent views on these issues. Of course, then come the issues of rule of law, LGBT rights, which amplify these issues even more, because Poland, being the largest, most important country in the region from the Eastern European flank, let's say, mm-hmm. Has, and for a long time, Poland has come out as the champion of democracy, especially when it comes to Belarus. Poland has, for a very long time, promoted the idea of, Belarus being more open, Belsat, all these things that, have been carried out with the help of Poland.
Right.
But its own debate over rule of law and other issues with Brussels undermine that message. For France, again, going back to the way that Poland and France see the transatlantic relationship, whereas Poland depends on the US or puts its hopes on the US and NATO, France, like we said before, France wants a role for Europe. So therefore, these divergent views. And we can extrapolate that and apply it to other cases as well. Eastern Mediterranean, it's the same thing. France there, basically backing up Greece and Cyprus, wants to, assert Europe's sort of unity, but also Europe's role when it deals with the outside world. So here it's a matter of, again, the visit is in Lithuania, and it was used as a way to visit the 200 French troops that are part of the enhanced forward presence in Lithuania. It's symbolic. It comes, I think, about a year after the visit to Poland, if I'm not mistaken, or almost a year, maybe a few months. Yeah, almost a year.
In February, Mr. Macron visited Poland.
It was in February. But it's a symbolic. It's a symbol of how France sees the whole relationship in the region. Probably what would have to happen, and now I think we're moving a little bit away from Belarus and we're going more into other issues like the Eastern Mediterranean, but these are intertwined. So everyone will have to give in a little bit. So France will have to address some of Poland's concerns when it comes to Belarus, for instance. Poland would have to address some of Cyprus's concerns or Greece's concerns when it comes to Turkey, because at the end of the day, it's really about, what are we really talking? We're talking about sanctions, which are very symbolic. They don't really have a huge effect, but it sends a message. So most likely, it's really about everyone trying to give in a little bit to the other in order to come out with some type of common European voice.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think we've somewhat exhausted the question of the Western involvement in the Eastern theater for the time being, at least. So perhaps let's move slightly beyond that for now, although this still goes to European politics. By the way, I noted down this morning an interesting quote, which I also did. I think it's fairly pertinent to what you said about Macron. It's by a senior fellow for Middle East security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, a British think tank. His name is Hokaim. And he said that France has reached the limits of the Macron method. Good intentions are no substitute for leverage. I think at some point, this may precisely be the ultimate test for the French muscles in the region. But going beyond the Eastern European theater, I was wondering what could you tell possibly about, let's say, the future of the broader landscape as it unfolds now, because one major event that is coming up that may really change lots of the sub-directions and the larger direction in terms of at least the transatlantic alliance is the US election that is coming up in a month. And then in Poland, there has been this talk lately about, where does this leaves us and what are the possible scenarios. And let's say in the geopolitical discussion, it was suggested several times that there are at least 3 major scenarios as to how the situation may, evolve. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on the probability of these scenarios being materialized. So the first one would be that the United States, they managed to convince Europe to somehow, put an end to their increasingly economically intense relationship with China, because China, the BRI, the investments, its presence even in Belarus. You must have seen, that those pictures of Lukashenko basically talking to the Chinese ambassador. I think it was last week, as if he was, someone nearly as important as Putin. So the Chinese are here, and the US do not want us dealing with them, obviously, for many reasons. But the second scenario would be precisely that US fails to do so. Fails to convince Europe that China should be a no-go, and Europe actually chooses to orient itself towards China, and eventually perhaps even becomes a sort of far end of the larger Euro-Asian Chinese project, if it sees the day. And then the third scenario would be, I think, something along the lines of what Macron dreams for the future of Europe, which is that Europe does manage to overcome its numerous obstacles, especially those at the internal level, and manages to position itself as the third pole in the tripolar world, so to speak, made of US, China, and EU, and certainly Russia. Will have its place somewhere, but maybe lesser than it has now, given its weakness and the way things go for Russia now. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think this one of these scenarios is more likely to happen than the other ones?
Yeah, I mean, there are multiple things happening here. On one hand, you do have a Europe that for the past 10 years, probably ever since the financial crisis, the last one in 2008, 2009, has been more prone to Chinese investments, which are not just investments from Chinese companies looking to get a good deal. They're state-owned companies or companies very close to the Chinese state that are coming in, and they're not just buying up companies in Europe that are in trouble. They're strategically acquiring key assets or key components of our economy. You have the example of the Piraeus port in Greece. You have examples of strategic companies, also technologies that they are employing for dual use, which means they have a civilian purpose, but they also have a military purpose, which then they're applying it to their military assets as well. And this is done, like I said, not only in order to have an economic presence or foothold in Europe, but also to influence our foreign policy as well. And the example of that would be, look at the ways in which a common European position has been undermined a lot of times by countries that have a lot of Chinese investment in their countries, and which have literally watered down the position of the EU on a number of files: human rights, Tibet, Xinjiang. It's basically it's quite evident that there is that component as well. However, this has also triggered a greater awareness in Europe. So I wouldn't say that today, as opposed to maybe 2-3 years ago, Europe is as naive when it comes to these strategic type of Chinese investments. That's one thing. And you do have signs of Europe looking to see how it can rein in a bit of more oversight and to screen basically these strategic acquisitions, both by creating a framework for sharing information about these strategic acquisitions and screening them, but also acquisitions by Chinese state-owned companies in essence. So you have this trend that is ongoing, and I don't think this would stop necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're right, you have the US elections, which would change a lot. Not just when it comes to how Europe positions itself on this issue, but also on broader issues as well. Like European sovereignty, the whole idea of European sovereignty, why did it come about? It came about because, you have in the White House, you have an administration that makes it questionable, at least for Europeans, whether they can depend on the transatlantic relationship or not. This basically, it questions something that has existed for 7 years
mm-hmm.
or more. So depending on who sits in the White House, European sovereignty would either have greater traction or maybe less. Because if you have in the White House an administration that continues on the path of this administration of Donald Trump, so if you have Donald Trump too, most likely European sovereignty would have greater traction, of course, and then Europeans would have to think, okay, how do we position ourselves as a third pillar between these greater powers, US and China, and Russia to a lesser extent.
Mm-hmm.
If you have Biden in the White House, chances are the transatlantic relationship would have a reset, and then Europeans would start trusting the U.S. Once again, and then it wouldn't be a matter of Europe falling in the American camp, but it would be a matter of Europe coordinating with the United States a lot more when it comes to China.
Mm-hmm.
And pressing China on the issues that matter: human rights, free and fair trade, reforms, which China has been lagging on. So I wouldn't say that Europeans would become like one of your scenarios was sort of the Western colony or the Western fiefdom of the Belt and Road Initiative. But the U.S. elections, you're definitely right that it would generate a rethink probably within Europe and also across the Atlantic about how we see ourselves in relationship to China.
Mm-hmm. All right. It'll indeed be fascinating to watch, right? How these events unfold. I mean, this year already has been so surprising in so many ways, and yet we have the still the U.S. election, which is probably more consequential than the past ones, at least in the past several decades, probably. If we could have perhaps a little bit of a focus now, just like a zoom in slightly on one particular region which you mentioned earlier, the Mediterranean. Going back to France for a second with a tiny Eastern European twist still, because two things I wanted to mention with regard to the tensions between France, France and Turkey, and the Greece that is having its own spot with Turkey concerning the gas exports. Like on one hand, there was this, the happenstance of Greece vetoing, EU action on Belarus, as long as the EU doesn't put more effort into its own affairs first. On one hand, and then on the other, there was France that announced that they will be signing a treaty with Greece, under which France will oblige itself to provide military assistance support in case of a conflict with Turkey. It didn't come cheap because Greece will be buying French frigates and French jet fighters. So, and obviously, I mean, most likely before even these are shipped, that conflict will have been extinguished many times by then. So I wonder what your take is on this, because I said there are two, it's a kind of Eastern European touches here. One was that me referring to Belarus, but the other is that in Poland we have this long-going resentment about France not having come to help us in 1939. I mean, it's a complicated story, as you very well know. However, that idea of the Westerners not willing to die for Gdańsk, as they used to say, "Personne va mourir pour Gdańsk," as there was I think there was a slogan on the posters back in the day. So as to that, these are empty words that have no real meaning behind. So I was wondering if you think that the same goes for that French commitment towards Greece, and potentially if France, going back for a second to what we talked about in terms of the Eastern European affairs, if France perhaps ever foresees similar steps with regard to some other countries in that region. On the other hand, do you feel like, so to speak, the French philosophy of in terms of acting in such circumstances has changed since the 70 years ago, or are the methods still the same?
No, I think the Mediterranean in general is going to be a region to watch, because a lot of the alliances there are being rethought a little bit. And also what's important to watch here again is the ability of France to basically get this European sovereignty and get everyone to agree by talking to all the stakeholders. The question is France willing to go to war with Turkey over Greece? I think the question is, can France work with the Germans and play bad cop, good cop in order to get the Turks to negotiate? Because that's what the Greeks want. And that's also what the Turks want, by the way. I mean, the Turks seem like, they have perhaps, the stronger cards here, but actually, if you look at Turkey right now, they're stretched quite thin. They have domestic issues, including economic issues that they need to deal with. They're stretched in Libya, they're stretched in Syria. Now you have the issue with Nagorno-Karabakh, where Turkey is obviously a major stakeholder. You have the East Mediterranean. So the Turks, are not exactly in a great position here either. On the other hand, you look at the French, and you look at them signaling that they're willing to send military support to the Greeks. And the question arises, okay, but is France willing to go all the way? I think so far at least, and of course we have to see what happens with this going forward, especially looking at what happens at the next meeting between European leaders. But France and Germany so far, at least so far, have been able to very skillfully play this good cop, bad cop kind of role, where Germany is the good cop and says, no, we need to talk with the Turks, we need to be able to negotiate with them, we need them on a number of files, including migration, which is true, we do. And then the French coming in a bit more with that, hard power, yeah, but Turkey is not really a partner, which is what Macron said. Mm-hmm. So far, it seems that the Turks have been actually showing that they would be able to talk to the Greeks. And it's really about that, changing the calculus of Erdogan. Because Erdogan, the messages he's been sending is, I am willing to use military force if I have to. And it's really to get him to back off and say, actually, no, I will be able to, I'll come out and I'll sit down at the negotiating table.
I think so.
And you see the same thing sort of happening a little bit in the other parts of the Mediterranean, in Libya, for instance, where France has made overtures to Italy, and Italy in Libya has been supporting the same faction that Turkey has, actually. Mm-hmm. But it made overtures to Italy and said, okay, we need to talk about a Pax Mediterraneana, and that's basically a Latin sort of twang to proposal, but really it's about getting EU member states to coordinate a little bit more, and then to get out that European sort of voice when it comes to foreign affairs. When it comes to Cyprus and Greece and Turkey and the sanctions issues, again, it's not so much that Cyprus and Greece do not want to put sanctions on Belarus. They're just trying to internationalize their issue and say, look, you need to pay attention to this, otherwise we're not going to be helpful on other files. Mm-hmm. And here's where I think, everyone has a responsibility. Ultimately, France and Poland do need to talk to each other. Greece does, and Cyprus do have to show that they're a bit more sensitive to the issues of Eastern Europeans, and Poland has to give some assurances to Cyprus and sort of budge a little bit on Turkey, even though to Poland, Turkey is an important partner, and it's obvious why. But again, we're talking here about symbolism. I mean, these sanctions, whether we talk about Belarus or Turkey, they're really, they don't have such a great effect, but they do help send out a message. And it's going to be the ability of, again, when we speak about France, because France and Macron have been the sort of the center of our discussion here. It's really the ability of Macron to be able to pull this off. Can he manage to genuinely make the key stakeholders feel like he's engaging with everybody? Because that is usually the criticism when it comes to Macron, that, he has these great ideas and these, big ideas, but, is he really talking to the rest of Europeans? And if he can show he can do that, then he can get member states to budge on these key files.
Mm. Yeah, lots of developments to follow, right? Because it's only the eventual outcome of all of them playing out together that will basically tell us how what's to come. Harry, thank you very very much. I much appreciated you finding time for this today. I think this was very productive and instructive for our listeners, some of whom are in Poland and were very keen to learn precisely about what's what is this whole thing about France, coming here and telling us what to do. So this certainly was enlightening in this regard. Um, Thanks, and yeah, to all our listeners, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Every week we will be uploading another talk with an European leader in a given industry or an expert, and we will be discussing sea affairs, business, regulations, law, technology, media, and more. Yep, thank you very much, and stay tuned.